I think within the SEC, Alabama would be the best bet. That does not take a rocket scientist, which I'm not, to come up with. Outside, I like Ohio State. There's still an issue about how the quarterback situation will land, but other than that, they probably have as much talent, if not more, than anyone in the country. If you're looking for a wild card, certainly Southern Cal with the Heisman Trophy winner Caleb Williams. But after having said all that, I believe Georgia is going to do what no one has done. And what's so interesting about Georgia, Kirby Smart was a big part of the last major assault on a three-peat. He was the defensive coordinator 10 years ago when Alabama was derailed on the famous kick six play, one of the most epic plays in college football history. Alabama didn't win that year. Kirby Smart, now the head coach of Georgia, with a chance to do what he couldn't do as an assistant for Nick Saban.
You seen Georgia's schedule this year? Like who they open up with? I believe it's UT Martin, not Oregon like it was last year. And we even saw what happened in that game. It was no contest. I'm with Paul on this. I have a hard time believing that there's going to be anybody who unseats Georgia this year. They can lose 25 players to the NFL draft over the last 2 seasons. They can have coordinators come and go, and this team is still as dominant as it's ever been. There's certainly been a changing of the guard, not only in the SEC, but in college football, where that was Alabama's claim to the throne, and now it's Georgia's. You brought up USC, Paul. That's the only team, and I know they've got a lot of things they've got to figure out defensively for us to take them seriously at that level, but they have the reigning Heisman Trophy winner in Caleb Williams. He had 52 touchdowns last year and had that hamstring injury, I believe it was what it was, which slowed him up at the end of last year in the championship, in the Pac-12 championship game. There's little for me to believe that could not be at least the biggest threat to Georgia if they somehow match up in the college football playoff. But it's tough to think that this Georgia team, in what it's trying to do, you mentioned since the Poll era began, I look back at this, I forgot, Minnesota was the last team, 1934 through 1936 to three-peat. That's a completely different era of college football. I find it hard to believe that anybody's going to be unseating Georgia in that realm this year.
Okay, Paul, go ahead. I just wanted to throw in there, too, like, look, I think everyone that watches college football understands how good Georgia is. For me, Paul, though, it's a little bit of getting out of their own way. They've had some off-the-field issues that have been, talked about widely. And now Kirby Smart mentioned them being the hunted in college football. Can they get out of their own way here this upcoming season?
I think that ultimately is the biggest issue. And when Kirby Smart arrives here in Nashville, that is going to be the question, because he has had a very dreadful and tragic offseason. It began within a week of the national championship game when one of the star players and an assistant personnel person was tragically killed. You had the Jalen Carter situation after the fact, after he left Georgia. But ultimately, Georgia has, I think the biggest issue is not off the field. It's staying motivated. You mentioned the schedule. It is dreadful, but there is a reason why it is so bad. Georgia has always played one of the toughest preseason schedules in the country. Clemson a couple of years ago, and next year, you mentioned Oregon. They've had Notre Dame. They had a road trip to Norman on the schedule this year, and when Oklahoma and Texas entered the SEC 2 years ago, the SEC decided they did not want Oklahoma playing a one-off before they came into the league. So that game had to be scrapped, and you have a bunch of nobodies on the schedule. They really don't even have a challenge, I don't think.
Talked about widely, and now Kirby Smart mentioned them being the hunted in college football. Can they get out of their own way here this upcoming season?
I think that ultimately is the biggest issue, and when Kirby Smart arrives here in Nashville, that is going to be the question, because he has had a very dreadful and tragic offseason. It began within a week of the national championship game when one of the star players and an assistant personnel person was tragically killed. You had the Jalen Carter situation after the fact, after he left Georgia. But ultimately, Georgia has, I think the biggest issue is not off the field. It's staying motivated. You mentioned the schedule. It is dreadful, but there is a reason why it is so bad. Georgia has always played one of the toughest preseason schedules in the country. Clemson a couple of years ago, and next year, you mentioned Oregon. They've had Notre Dame. They had a road trip to Norman on the schedule this year, and when Oklahoma and Texas entered the SEC 2 years ago, the SEC decided they did not want Oklahoma playing a one-off before they came into the league. So that game had to be scrapped, and you have a bunch of nobodies on the schedule. They really don't even have a challenge, I don't think, until later in the year in November when they go to Knoxville, which is which was number one in the country last year when Georgia took them on. But I think Kirby Smart is going to have a hard time, and I think ultimately, in talking to coaches in the past, including Nick Saban, motivating players to win a third one is very, very difficult.
And I would say, I mean, the off-the-field stuff is certainly a very big concern. You can't just sweep that under the rug and expect everything's going to get better from the start of their own off-season program beginning here in a couple weeks. The quarterback situation, though, at Georgia, when we were talking about who's the most complete offense in the SEC, I don't think you can go ahead and give them that claim just yet because they are having turnover at that position with Stetson Bennett leaving, getting drafted by the Rams, and we still don't know as far as like what that's going to be. Alabama doesn't have its quarterback yet, but both of these teams, I'm sure will figure it out. But as far as if you want to poke holes in anything going on with Alabama right now, or Georgia right now, it's about the one thing you can do.
It's like almost you're speaking into existence what we're about to talk about, and that would be Alabama. Now, Paul, I know you half-jokingly said it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think that they would be one of Georgia's biggest competitors, but the reality of the situation is they came up short last year. They didn't make the playoffs. We saw this in 2019, and the very next season they actually won a national championship. But if for some reason Alabama does miss the playoffs again this year, are we going to be talking about Nick Saban's legacy in a different light?
I think, yes, you have to. And first of all, nothing is going to take away from what he's accomplished. And for those who don't follow this closely, he's won 6 national championships at Alabama since arriving in 2007. He won another one at LSU. But if he is in the same league as somebody who has now, at the end of this season, won 3, then that's a big hit on his legacy. And I think you also have to question Saban for what happened last year. He had the best team in the country going in. They were nearly unanimous. And at the NFL draft, in case anyone wasn't paying attention, let me refresh your memory. He had the best offensive player and the best defensive player, Will Anderson on defense, and of course the Heisman Trophy winner from 2 years ago and the #1 pick, Bryce Young, on offense. And with that, he still couldn't get it done. The defense let him down. There were mental lapses across the board. They had 17 penalties in the Texas game. I think they had just as many against Tennessee. And some of the coaching was subpar, too. And, I mean, Nick Saban, I've never seen a Nick Saban team get scorched like they did in the final minute against Tennessee in Knoxville when Hendon Hooker led that team down the field in 4 plays and kicked a field goal and sent Alabama home a loser. So those are serious questions. And one more thing about Alabama. 2 new coordinators. One has been there a couple of times, Kevin Steele on defense, but Tommy Rees comes over from Notre Dame. They don't have an established quarterback. And think about this for a second. The last couple of Alabama quarterbacks, Jalen Hurts, Tua Tagovailoa, Mac Jones, and Bryce Young. I think you guys can figure out the rest.
Mm-hmm. Only at a place like Alabama, when you lose 2 regular season games after the same coach got you to 6 national championships, does the uproar feel like it's DEFCON level 5. And fair or not, that's the legacy that follows Nick Saban throughout his career. He's led this team to 194 wins since he took over in 2007. Paul mentioned the 6 national championships. There will never be hot seat talk when it comes to Nick Saban, but as far as legacy talk, if they don't make the CFP this year, if they don't get to a national championship, his days of winning championships are over because Kirby Smart knows what it's like to build a dynasty, how long something like that takes, because he was part of 4 of those national championships with Alabama. They're on the cusp of something. They have passed Alabama by in the SEC. Nick Saban is no longer the king, the guy who runs college football. That now belongs to Kirby Smart. And the parity we're seeing right now, whether it's from NIL, whether it's from transfer portal, 2 things that Nick Saban has kind of tried to push to the wayside, kind of tried to work around. He wants to do things, recruit in a traditional manner. That makes it much more difficult for him to conduct business the way that he's been so used to and so successful with throughout his career. So if this year is anything other than a championship for Alabama, which it's going to be hard to do when you have a league that also has Ohio State, Michigan, even Penn State chomping at the bit here, trying to take some of that shine away from the SEC, he could be on the cusp of no longer being able to claim that he is a contender for a natty in college football.
Now, I will say this, Paul. Yes, Alabama lost 2 regular season games last year, and yet still we were all holding our breath wondering if they were going to sneak their way into the playoff. But nonetheless, Courtney says there will be no hot seat talk. But if Alabama loses more than just 2 games in the regular season, where there isn't that suspicion heading into the playoff, could there be?
No. I mean, let me say this for the record. Nick Saban is still the greatest coach of all time. And he finished last year 5th in the country, the year before 2nd in the country, and the year before 1st. He had the best recruiting class in the country. But these are fair conversations about where he stands, though. And I think the one thing that he would argue, and he'll turn 72 years old in October, that next year the door opens a little bit wider.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming, sports, and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.